It started with a crumpled $5 bill, 2 singles, and a brutal death sentence. While the worst blizzard in local history swallowed the county, one desperate woman bought 300 abandoned sheep left to freeze. What survived that catastrophic winter night didn't just defy nature, it warmed an entire, broken town. The sky above the Bitterroot Valley had already turned the color of a bruised plum by 3 in the afternoon. The air did not just feel cold, it felt heavy, carrying the unmistakable, metallic scent of a historic freeze. Inside the rusted aluminum siding of the county feed store, the weather radio crackled with increasingly frantic warnings. Meteorologists were calling it the blizzard of the decade, a monstrous low-pressure system barreling down from the Canadian Rockies, promising sub-zero temperatures and wind that could rip the roof off a sturdy barn. Abigail Harrelson stood near the front counter, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of black coffee. She was 34, with hands calloused from years of hard labor and eyes that had seen too much loss. Just 14 months prior, the bank had taken her family's generational farm. Now she lived in a drafty single-wide trailer on a leased acreage owned by an elderly man named Arthur Pendleton. She had nothing left to her name but 2 aging border collies, a beat-up 1986 Ford pickup, and a stubborn refusal to leave the valley that held her father's grave. The bell above the feed store door violently jingled as the wind forced it open. In stepped Richard Gable, the wealthiest and most ruthlessly pragmatic rancher in the county. Or at least, he used to be. The recession had hit Gable's expansive cattle and sheep operations hard. Rumors had been swirling for weeks that Gable was quietly liquidating his assets and skipping town before the federal auditors arrived. Gable didn't bother brushing the snow off his expensive Stetson. He stomped his boots, his face a mask of bitter exhaustion. He marched straight to the counter, ignoring Abigail entirely, and slammed his leather gloves down next to the register. "Betty!" Gable barked at the owner, his voice carrying over the whistling wind outside. "I need you to notarize a liability release, right now." Betty Farnsworth, a woman whose grandmotherly appearance hid a spine of pure steel, peered over her reading glasses. "A release for what, Richard? The roads are closing in an hour. You shouldn't even be driving." "For the flock in the lower basin," Gable snapped, looking out the frosted window. "The transport trucks never showed up. The buyer out of Idaho backed out an hour ago because of the pass closing. I've got 300 Merino Cross ewes trapped down in the river basin. No feed, no shelter. I'm heading to the airport in Billings before the highways freeze solid." Abigail slowly lowered her coffee cup. The lower basin was a deadly frost pocket. When a blizzard rolled in, the wind funneled through that canyon, dropping temperatures to 30 below zero. "You're leaving them?" Abigail asked, her voice quiet but piercing. Gable sneered, glancing at her patched denim coat. "I'm not leaving them, Abigail. I'm accepting reality. They're already dead. I just need a piece of paper proving I abandoned the asset before the storm hit. So the county can't hit me with the environmental disposal fines when the snow melts, and they find 300 carcasses." The sheer callousness of the statement hung in the warm air of the feed store, thick and suffocating. Gable was trying to legally wash his hands of a mass freezing. He was looking for a patsy, someone to take technical ownership of the doomed flock, so he could board his flight with a clean ledger. "You can't just leave them to freeze, Richard," Abigail said, stepping closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 300 lives, 300 beating hearts, left to turn into ice statues in the dark. "Watch me," Gable retorted. "Unless you want them, Harrelson, you always were a bleeding heart. I'll sell them to you right now, but you take the liability. When the EPA comes sniffing around in April for the cleanup costs, it's on your head." He was mocking her. He knew she was broke. He knew she had no land, no barn, and no feed. Abigail plunged her trembling hand into the pocket of her coat. Her fingers brushed against the only money she had to her name until her next shift at the diner. She pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and 2 worn singles. She flattened them out on the wooden counter, sliding them toward Gable. $7, Abigail said, her voice completely steady, though her soul was shaking. "I'm buying the flock." Gable stared at the meager pile of cash, then erupted into a dark, humorless laugh. "You're insane. You don't have a barn. You don't have a truck big enough. They are going to die tonight, Abigail, and you're going to be on the hook for $10,000 in carcass removal fees." "Draw up the bill of sale, Betty," Abigail said, her eyes locked on Gable. Betty hesitated, her pen hovering over the notary pad. "Abby, honey, he's right. It's a suicide mission. The temperature is dropping a degree every 10 minutes. You'll freeze to death just trying to get down to the basin." "Draw it up," Abigail repeated, her tone leaving no room for debate. Within 5 minutes, the paperwork was signed. Gable snatched the $7, shook his head in mocking disbelief, and hurried out into the escalating storm. Abigail folded the bill of sale, tucked it inside her shirt against her heart, and whistled for her dogs. Waiting in the truck, she had just purchased 300 freezing sheep for $7. Now, she had exactly 2 hours of daylight left to perform a miracle, or she would die in the snow alongside them. The drive to the lower basin was a descent into a white nightmare. Abigail's old Ford fishtailed violently on the black ice, the headlights doing little to pierce the blinding curtain of horizontal snow. Beside her on the bench seat, Barnaby and Rust, her 2 veteran border collies, whined softly. They sensed the urgency, their ears pinned back against the howling wind that rattled the truck's thin windows. When she finally reached the ridge overlooking the basin, Abigail slammed the truck into park and killed the engine. The heater had been struggling anyway, but the sudden silence in the cab was deafening, quickly replaced by the roaring gale outside. She zipped her coat to her chin, pulled her wool scarf over her mouth, and kicked the door open. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She stumbled through knee-deep drifts to the edge of the ridge. Down below, huddled against a frail, useless wire fence, was a massive gray shape. It was the flock, 300 merino cross sheep, tightly packed in a desperate circle of survival. The outer ring of the flock was already completely covered in snow, their thick wool heavy with ice. They were bleeding, a haunting, pitiful sound that carried up the canyon walls, a chorus of the doomed. Abigail scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding and falling in the powder, the dogs bounding expertly beside her. When she reached the flock, the reality of her impossible purchase set in. These were heavy, terrified animals. They were already lethargic from the plunging temperatures. She had no trailers. She had no massive barn. But Abigail did have one thing Richard Gable didn't: an intimate, generational knowledge of the land. 3 miles north, on the edge of old Arthur Pendleton's leased property, was Miller's Hollow. It was a deep, natural limestone ravine, heavily wooded with ancient pines and shielded from the prevailing northern winds. It wasn't a barn, but the rock walls trapped geothermal heat, and the dense tree canopy acted as a natural roof against the snow. If she could get them there, they might survive, but moving 300 freezing, stubborn sheep 3 miles through a blinding blizzard on foot was a task bordering on madness. "Come by, Barnaby. Away to me, Rust," Abigail shouted, her voice immediately swallowed by the wind. But the dogs didn't need to hear her perfectly. They read her body language. The collies sprang into action, darting around the perimeter of the shivering mass, barking and nipping at the frozen heels of the lead ewes. At first, the sheep refused to move. The instinct to huddle and wait for death was overpowering. Abigail waded into the middle of the flock, pushing, shoving, and physically lifting the front heavy ewes to break their formation. "Move!" she screamed, her lungs burning with the sub-zero air. "You are not dying today." Slowly, agonizingly, the gray mass began to shift. A led ewe took a hesitant step forward into the snow, followed by another. Soon, a long, woolly column began to march through the blizzard. The first mile was brutal. The snow was now thigh-deep in places, and Abigail had to break the trail herself, using her own body as a snowplow so the sheep could follow in her wake. Her jeans froze solid to her legs. Her eyelashes were caked with ice, forcing her to blink constantly just to see the faint silhouette of the trees ahead. Just as they crossed the county highway, flashing blue lights cut through the whiteout. It was Sheriff Boyd Mitchell in his heavy-duty 4x4 cruiser. He skidded to a halt, blocking the road, and rolled his window down an inch. "Abigail, what in God's name are you doing?" Mitchell bellowed over his loudspeaker. "The county is in a state of emergency. Get in the truck." Abigail marched up to the cruiser, her face pale and frostbitten, looking like a ghost of the plains. "I can't, Boyd. I have to get them to the hollow." "Gable abandoned them, Abby. Let them go. You're going to freeze to death out here for a bunch of livestock that isn't even yours." "I bought them," she screamed back, pulling the frozen crumpled bill of sale from her coat and pressing it against the glass. "They are mine and I don't leave my own behind. Now get your truck out of my way or grab a flashlight and help me." Sheriff Mitchell stared at her, utterly stunned by the fierce, feral determination in her eyes. He knew Abigail's history. He knew the heartbreak she had endured losing her family farm. He realized then that this wasn't just about the sheep. It was about saving something in a world that had taken everything from her. Shaking his head, Mitchell didn't arrest her. Instead, he turned his cruiser sideways, using the massive vehicle to block the biting wind, and flipped on his spotlights to illuminate the path toward the woods. Empowered by the light, the dogs worked with renewed fury. They pushed the flock over the asphalt and into the tree line. By the time they reached the mouth of Miller's Hollow, the sun had fully set, and the temperature had plummeted to 22 degrees below zero. Abigail's extremities were entirely numb. She was operating purely on adrenaline and instinct. As the flock poured into the sheltered limestone ravine, the wind instantly died down. The relief was palpable. But it wasn't enough. The air was still lethally cold. Abigail grabbed two massive, heavy-duty tarps she had dragged out of her truck bed earlier. She tied them across the narrowest part of the ravine, creating a makeshift ceiling to trap the body heat of the 300 animals. She sat dead center in the middle of the flock, pulling her two exhausted dogs into her lap, letting the thick, lanolin-rich wool of the surrounding sheep press against her. As the worst storm in a century raged directly above their heads, Abigail closed her eyes, surrounded by the deep, rumbling breathing of 300 lives she had bought for $7. The real test, however, was whether any of them would wake up when the morning light finally broke. The darkness inside Miller's Hollow was absolute, a heavy, suffocating ink that pressed against Abigail's frozen eyelids. Outside the limestone walls, the blizzard shrieked with a ferocity that sounded almost human, a relentless, deafening howl of wind tearing through the ancient pine branches, snapping century-old limbs like dry twigs. But down in the ravine, beneath the heavy canvas tarps, an eerie, fragile microclimate had begun to form. 300 bodies, packed shoulder to shoulder, radiated a collective, desperate heat. The air grew thick with the pungent, unmistakable smell of damp lanolin, wet earth, and the rhythmic, foggy breath of the massive flock. For the first 2 hours, Abigail simply focused on staying awake. She sat cross-legged on a patch of frozen dirt in the center of the huddled mass, her arms wrapped fiercely around her two border collies. Barnaby and Rust were pressing their warm noses against her neck, their canine instincts screaming that their master's core temperature was dropping to a critical level. Abigail's toes had lost feeling completely. A sharp, needle-like pain in her fingers had slowly given way to a terrifying, wooden numbness. She knew the signs of severe hypothermia. She had grown up in this valley. First came the shivering, then the burning, then the dangerous, lethargic warmth that tricked the mind into falling asleep in the snow, never to wake up. To fight the creeping darkness, she forced herself to talk out loud. She spoke to the dogs, and she spoke to the sheep. She recited the names of the mountains that framed the Bitterroot Valley. She replayed the memory of her late father, teaching her how to deliver a breech lamb in the dead of winter when she was only 12 years old. She remembered his rough, calloused hands guiding hers, his voice steady and calm. "The cold only wins if you stop moving, Abby," he had told her. "You are the steward of these animals. They rely on you. You don't get to quit just because you're tired." Those words echoed in her freezing mind just as a sharp, violent crack resonated above the flock. The snow had been falling at an astonishing rate of 3 inches an hour. The immense weight of the wet, packed powder had finally overwhelmed the precarious rigging of Abigail's makeshift roof. The thick paracord holding the eastern corner of the heaviest tarp suddenly snapped under the strain. A massive avalanche of snow and ice cascaded directly into the hollow, burying 24 sheep on the perimeter and exposing a 20-foot gap to the merciless, howling wind. Panic rippled through the flock instantly. The sudden blast of sub-zero air broke their survival trance. The ewes began to bleat frantically, shoving against one another, threatening to trample the smaller animals in their desperate bid to escape the falling snow. "No! Hold your ground!" Abigail screamed, her voice raspy and weak. She violently shoved the dogs off her lap and forced her frozen joints to move. She stumbled over the shifting backs of the terrified sheep, plunging her bare hands into the snowbank to dig out the buried animals. She hauled them up by their thick fleece, her muscles screaming in agony. But the real danger was the open roof. The wind was swirling into the ravine, rapidly sucking the trapped body heat away. Abigail grabbed the flailing edge of the heavy tarp. It felt like grabbing a sheet of solid iron. The wind whipped the canvas with the force of a sail in a hurricane, violently yanking her off her feet. She slammed hard into the limestone wall, her shoulder flaring with blinding pain. She scrambled back up, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She had to tie the grommet to an exposed root on the ravine wall, but her fingers were completely useless. They wouldn't bend. Weeping from the sheer frustration and physical agony, Abigail used her teeth to pull her heavy leather glove off. She gripped the icy paracord with her bare, frost-bitten hands, tearing the skin on her palms as she forced the rope through the metal eyelet. She pulled with every ounce of strength she had left, leveraging her entire body weight against the howling gale, and finally managed to loop the knot around the root. The tarp snapped taut. The wind was sealed out once more. Abigail collapsed into the snow, completely spent. She couldn't feel her hands. She couldn't feel her legs. The terrifying, warm euphoria of hypothermia began to wash over her brain. She looked at Barnaby, who was furiously licking her icy face, but the dog seemed to be fading into a blurry distance. She had done it. She had secured the roof. Now she just needed to rest her eyes for a single minute. Just 1 minute. Suddenly, a brilliant, blinding beam of yellow light sliced through the gaps in the trees above. Abigail blinked slowly, thinking her dying mind was playing tricks on her. But then came the deep, mechanical roar of a heavy-duty diesel engine, fighting its way over the ridge. Over the howling wind, she heard a voice boom through a megaphone. "Abigail! Abby, are you down there?" It was Wyatt Mercer, a local mechanic and lifelong friend of her father. Moments later, 3 figures in heavy snowmobile suits came sliding down the embankment into the hollow, carrying powerful halogen flashlights. Leading them was old Arthur Pendleton, the man who owned the land she leased, clutching a heavy thermos. "Good God Almighty," Arthur breathed, sweeping his flashlight over the sea of 300 living, breathing sheep safely tucked under the tarps. He rushed to Abigail, who was slumped against the stone wall. He unscrewed the thermos and forced a cup of scalding, sugary tea to her blue lips. "Sheriff Mitchell radioed the town," Wyatt explained, frantically wrapping Abigail in 3 layers of heated foil emergency blankets. "Told us you were making a suicidal stand in the hollow. Half the county was ready to ride out, but the roads are impassable. We had to take the snowcats over the logging trails." "The sheep," Abigail whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "Gable left them." "We know, honey, we know." Clara Jenkins, the town's large animal veterinarian, said softly as she knelt in the snow and began aggressively massaging Abigail's frozen hands to restore circulation. "You saved them, Abby. We brought propane heaters and square bales. We're going to fortify the roof and build a perimeter fire. You're not doing this alone anymore." As the townspeople sprang into action, setting up industrial heaters that immediately began to thaw the freezing air, Abigail finally let the tears fall. She watched the community her father had loved so deeply step into the breach, risking their own lives to bring light and warmth into the darkest, coldest night she had ever known. She wasn't just surviving anymore. They were going to make it. When the morning sun finally broke over the Bitterroot Valley, it illuminated a landscape that looked entirely alien. The blizzard had dumped 42 inches of snow in less than 18 hours. The world was a blinding, pristine white, silent and still under a cloudless, crystalline blue sky. Down in Miller's Hollow, the scene was entirely different. The snowcats had packed down a ramp out of the ravine, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the sharp scent of coffee. Abigail, exhausted but thoroughly warmed by the propane heaters and Clara's medical attention, stood at the mouth of the ravine with her clipboard. It was time for the moment of truth. Wyatt and Arthur dismantled the front barricade of the tarp. With a sharp whistle from Abigail, Barnaby and Rust darted in. Slowly, a massive gray river of wool began to flow out of the limestone shelter and up the snow-packed ramp into the brilliant morning sunlight. Clara stood beside Abigail, tallying the numbers as the sheep marched past, bleating loudly in the crisp air. 1 by 1, 10 by 10, 50 by 50. When the final ewe trotted up the embankment, Clara lowered her clicker and stared at the digital screen in absolute disbelief. 298, Clara whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Out of a flock of 300 abandoned sheep, locked in a frost pocket during a historically lethal blizzard, Abigail had lost only 2 of the oldest, frailest animals. It was an impossible survival rate. It was nothing short of a miracle. The sheer density of their combined body heat, the geographic luck of the limestone ravine, and Abigail's desperate tarp rigging had saved them. News of the survival spread through the snowed-in county like wildfire over the radio waves. Richard Gable, who had successfully boarded his flight to Billings, became an instant pariah. When he returned to the valley a week later, he found his remaining gates locked, his credit lines at the local feed stores severed by angry owners, and a massive investigation launched by the State Agricultural Board for gross criminal negligence and animal cruelty. Gable's reputation was reduced to ashes overnight. But for Abigail, the true twist of fate didn't arrive until 5 months later, when the snow finally melted and the Bitterroot Valley exploded into vibrant emerald green spring. It was mid-May, shearing season. Abigail had kept the massive flock grazing on Arthur Pendleton's leased land. The sheep were thriving, fat and healthy. She hired a professional shearing crew out of Bozeman to process the flock. What she didn't realize until the clippers hit the skin was exactly what she had purchased for $7. These weren't just standard merino cross sheep. During the extreme stress of the historic freeze, the sheep's biology had reacted to the catastrophic temperature drop by accelerating the production of a dense, hyperfine undercoat. Furthermore, because Gable had neglected to shear them the previous autumn to save money, the fleece was incredibly long, rich in lanolin, and structurally pristine. Samuel Reed, an elite textile buyer who sourced premium wool for high-end European outdoor brands, drove down from Missoula to inspect the clip. He stood in the dusty barn, running his fingers through the massive rolling bags of raw, unwashed wool. He pulled a single fiber, held it up to the light, and tested its tensile strength. Samuel turned to Abigail, adjusting his glasses. "Ms. Harrelson, I've been buying wool for 22 years. I've never seen a micron count this fine combined with a staple length this long." The extreme cold they endured. It essentially force grew a survival coat of the highest possible grade. The market for premium, ethically sourced, ultra-fine merino is currently skyrocketing because the Australian imports have been delayed by shipping strikes. Abigail wiped the sweat from her brow. "What are you telling me, Mr. Reed?" "I'm telling you that this isn't just wool. This is liquid gold in the garment industry," Samuel said smoothly. "For the raw clip of these 300 sheep, I am authorized to offer you $42,000, and I will pay the freight to haul it." Abigail's knees almost buckled. $42,000. She had bought the flock with a crumpled $5 bill and 2 singles. The transaction cleared 3 days later, but the story didn't end with a heavy bank account. Fate had one final, perfect twist in store. The legal fees, the criminal fines, and the sheer social isolation had finally broken Richard Gable's crumbling empire. The bank formally foreclosed on his remaining properties to cover his staggering debts. On a bright Tuesday morning in late June, Abigail walked into the First National Bank of the Bitterroot Valley. She didn't go to the teller. She walked straight into the branch manager's office. She sat down, placed a cashier's check on the polished mahogany desk, and pointed to a specific foreclosure listing in the bank's portfolio. It was her father's farm. The very land she had lost 14 months prior. The land Gable had ruthlessly tried to acquire for pennies on the dollar before his own financial collapse. By the end of the afternoon, the deed was signed. Abigail drove her old 1986 Ford pickup up the familiar gravel driveway, the summer sun casting long, golden shadows over the pastures. Barnaby and Rust hung their heads out the windows, catching the warm breeze. She parked in front of the old farmhouse, stepped out, and took a deep breath of the sweet, alfalfa-scented air. She looked out over the sprawling green fields, where 300 freshly shorn sheep were peacefully grazing on the land that finally belonged to them all. She had saved the flock, and in return, the flock had given her back her home. If this incredible true story of grit, survival, and the beautiful justice of fate inspired you, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. The human spirit, and a little bit of community, can conquer the darkest storms. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on these powerful, heartwarming tales. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Abigail's bravery, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think.